I should first start with what Yu-Gi-Oh means to me personally. I've known about Yu-Gi-Oh since I was a little kid, and I've been playing the trading card game by Konami since elementary school. While I don't want to wholly romanticize what at the end of the day was an excuse for my parents to spend a ton of money, Yu-Gi-Oh helped me develop friendships from playing and talking about the game, its anime, and even its video games, which themselves are often extremely interesting for their deviations, such as Duelist of the Roses adapting the War of the Roses, or Chef of Destruction for having an alternate season 4 of the anime as a plot, Forbidden Memories featuring a unique spin on Millennium World, and so on. I even managed to get a hold of those weird fake cards with all the spelling errors somehow, which to this day I'm not even sure how. They may as well just materialize into my hand. The point is, I'm about as original a fan of Yu-Gi-Oh! As is possible, and did in fact own that terrible Dark Magician Knight card. Despite my obsession with the various spin-offs though, it took me a bit longer to actually read the manga, although not that long since my ADHD makes me prefer reading comics over written novels due to the visual component. Yu-Gi-Oh! Isn't my favorite manga, that title goes to Hunter x Hunter, but it's a formative one that I think is overall still pretty well written revisiting it, which is why I feel the need to talk about it for so long. That being said, Yu-Gi-Oh! As a story has been warped and heavily commercialized both during and after the original manga's production, to the point that I feel a lot of people have a warped perspective on the manga's actual story due to its fragmentation between two radically different anime adaptations that either misunderstand key details or radically change details for their own narrative purposes. To actually talk about the manga as a story unto itself, we need to break down and discuss the various social and political pressures around the creation of the manga so the picture can become clear. Initially, the creator of Yu-Gi-Oh!, Kazuki Takahashi, intended the manga to be a variety of different games involving Yugi's friend group, with the mystery of Yugi's Millennium Puzzle being slowly revealed over time. However, reader response to Shadi in the new Game a Week format was pretty negative, while the response to the card game was extremely positive. Thus, under pressure from both fans and his editor, Takahashi slowly started shaping more and more of the story around the card game, while developing various plot threads and lore tidbits. This is both a blessing and a curse, since while arcs like Monster World and Dungeon Dice Monsters do show that character plot and lore progression can work regardless of the game being played, Yu-Gi-Oh! Was a weekly series that pretty desperately needed some form of structure to help keep the plot going, and not get the manga cancelled prematurely. It helps too that the way the card game is structured still allows for degrees of character expression and development, such as Mai's Harpy deck representing her independence and loneliness by her initially only having one monster she powers up over time, before developing more complex strategies using multiple monsters as she accepts the necessity of friendship in her life. It's similar to the usage of Nen in Hunter x Hunter, or Stans in JoJo, which all adhere to basic rules and logic that add structure to the story without fully restricting their narrative content. I never got the sense that Takahashi disliked dual monsters, as he likes D&D and likes using cards to convey character traits and motivations. However, his ambivalence towards the commercialization is fairly obvious considering how most of the actual world building has little to do with it, and this ends up also having an extreme dark side. In the Volume 20 Bunkaban, Takahashi discusses a scenario where he had to be hospitalized due to the amount of stress he was under creating the manga, and his editor mandated a 6-month deadline due to the manga's dwindling popularity after the end of Battle City. This forced him to abandon some pretty major story threads for the final arc, which he still expressed regret doing years later. This type of abuse of mangakas is not exclusive to Takahashi, as the grind of Weekly Shonen Jump has an adverse effect on a great deal of creators, who often have to push themselves into extremely perilous health conditions or face the potential risk of cancellation. Tite Kubo had to wrap up Bleach somewhat abruptly due to health concerns. Yoshihiro Tagashi developed extreme back problems that he's still dealing with, resulting in multi-year hiatuses. The list goes on. This is only covering creators who already had popular and successful series, with some series simply being cancelled if they can't meet unreasonable deadlines. Not to mention how fan expectations on story and character can negatively impact the manga's quality, often resulting in poor writing decisions to meet those demands. If you ever wondered why Gohan never became the main character of Dragon Ball, now you know. So the fact Takahashi had this pretty popular manga, suffered extreme health problems, and was then told in no uncertain terms to wrap it up quickly or else face cancellation, it makes me mad. It shows that mangaka are treated as disposable production factories rather than as people. How can you write the best story you can when you're forced to do so under extreme conditions? This negatively impacts the quality of their stories that are nevertheless quickly commercialized and consumed. This now leads to diving a bit into Yu-Gi-Oh's 2 anime adaptations, as they're quite a bit more popular than the manga, and their deviations from the source material affect how the story is discussed. The first one, by Toei Animation, adapts the first 7 volumes on a budget of about $5, which sounds a bit disparaging on my part, but consider one of the best adaptations ever made, Berserk 1997, was also made on a budget of $5. This adaptation has a lot of things going for it. The music is synthetic and extremely surreal, which fits the weirdness of the early manga. A few chapters were restructured to be more dramatic and to fill out a 22-minute time slot, which mostly benefits stories such as giving Anzu more to do. The voice work is also consistently decent, particularly Megumi Ogata as Yugi, who you might know better as Shinji Ikari. While this adaptation has its charm and adapts some critical storylines the second anime skips over, it's not all roses. A lot of the stories have weird changes and omissions, like removing multiple parts of Def Tea, with a large amount of time dedicated to filler plotlines and promoting the first terrible version of the card game that should never be played. While this does include Eileen Rao, the best character, it also includes the weird pet guy who's obsessed with turning fellow students into his pets. Honda's character was also entirely rewritten, and half of his dialogue is him thirsting after Miho, which never stops being irritating whenever it happens. Miho did exist in the manga in one chapter, but she got promoted to the main cast in order to balance out the dynamics a bit. This, in and of itself, isn't a bad choice, but they give her almost nothing to do, and she seriously lacks in complexity compared to other supporting characters such as Anzu or Jinochi. Also, to contrast directly with Berserk 1997, the actual direction of the series is seriously lacking. Obviously, the series is made with an extremely low budget, but many directorial choices don't seem to benefit the story being told, and just feel extremely odd by comparison. Whereas Berserk 1997 takes full advantage of the medium and in many ways surpasses the original text. Toei's Yu-Gi-Oh! Has its charm, but it fails as an effective adaptation and probably would have gotten worse if it had continued past its only season. The second anime, done by Studio Gallop, is a lot more consistent in terms of direction, with the characters more or less looking like how they do in the manga, and the color palette no longer being restricted to the Game Boy Color. This adaptation was wildly more successful than the first one, helped by its version of the trading card game being a lot more interesting to actually play, and remains by far the longest Yu-Gi-Oh! Series at 224 episodes alongside quite a few spin-offs. That said, as an actual adaptation, it's extremely messy, arguably messier than the Toei series. The first 7 volumes of the manga were skipped, totaling 59 chapters, or about 17% of the story's run, which partly made sense at the time since the Toei series had just aired in Japan roughly the year before, and it'd feel repetitive to adapt the same material again. But this ends up creating quite a few series-spanning issues, as the unadapted material still has to be reincorporated in order for the narrative to make any sense at all. This most adversely affects Duelist Kingdom, with a lot of important scenes changed or cut, most prominently with whatever's going on with Bakura, having Pegasus' backstory being relegated to him writing a book that they just find rather than him telling the group directly, whatever's going on with Bakura, and so on. This also isn't really getting into the filler, which while I actually do enjoy a lot on its own, the way it kind of rams itself into otherwise self-contained plots is pretty absurd.
See you around, Noah!
Alright, that little detour was a complete waste of my time and effort. So let's move on and pretend that nonsense never happened.
The sheer amount of it and the way previously canon material gets turned into filler is really sloppy and weird. Ryuji deserves so much better. It's an enjoyable adaptation, and it has a lot of high moments, but it fails to convey many key aspects of the original story, and in many ways feels like an excuse for advertising. Maybe it'll get a Shaman King 2021 treatment at some point and not skip over 7 volumes of material next time. Do us all a favor and canonize Eileen Rao, though. Oh yeah, and the less said about the 4Kids dub, probably for the better. I've seen both the dub and original sub, but I'll just keep using clips from the dub since they're funnier.
No way! But you can't fuse a trap card with a monster!
Looks to me like I just did, Alistair.
Now, with all that settled, let's actually talk about the story of the Yu-Gi-Oh! Manga. I'll divide the discussion into 8 separate chapters for ease of access, roughly correlating with the manga's arcs. Without further ado, let's start. Yu-Gi-Oh's start is defined by a lot of individual one-off stories and concepts. This isn't too unusual for a shonen series, see Bleach or Hunter x Hunter, and was initially a way for Takahashi to express his general interest in many games, along with him not yet thinking of the broader strokes of the plot. On the surface, the themes and ideas being presented are pretty basic: light versus dark, the power of friendship, random shocking events, and so on. However, mixed in with the standard fare is Yugi, or rather, the two Yugis. Regular Yugi is extremely shy and timid. He fails to conform to expectations of masculinity and is routinely mocked for it. After defending Honda and Jinochi from a bully and receiving Jinochi's sign of friendship, though, Yugi successfully completes the Millennium Puzzle he was working on for 8 years, and develops a different, more mature persona. This other Yugi, from here on will be referred to as Yami Yugi, meaning Dark Yugi, then proceeds to challenge wrongdoers to shadow games, with a penalty game issued to either the loser of the game or someone who rule breaks, which generally consists of illusions but also other fun things. This contrast between the two Yugis forms the backbone of the series, with Yugi's childlike nature leading to his important social connections, and Yami's skill in gaming providing a sword against the evil forces of the world. These two sides to the proverbial coin help keep the manga's tone in check, since the story's themes of friendship often have chapters end on an optimistic note even when something violent or dark happens. The expression, something you can show but you can't see, comes up a lot, and is demonstrated throughout the story of how acts of friendship show the connections between people without it being visible. Not everything here is important later, mainly the various one-off characters, but sometimes it's more interesting to have a feel for the characters in various situations, even if what they're doing doesn't matter to some overarching plot. Take Chapter 4, which has the famed serial killer immolation or whatever, but also shows Anzu's ambitions to become a dancer in America, in contrast to a social system determined to make that dream harder for her to realize, since she's not allowed to both go to school and work a job. This establishes an important theme, that of working towards the future even if things are difficult or scary, not letting the past and present determine what you can be. The present, as depicted in the series, is honestly pretty scary. There's roaming gangs of dudes for hire to beat people up, lots of petty theft, and often people in authority use their power for vain or greedy motives. Nowhere's is best exemplified than with chapters 9 and 10, which both introduces duel monsters so there can be a canary in the coal mine, but also rich boy Seto Kaiba, whose obsession of stealing Grandpa's blue eyes stems from the idea that only winning and losing is what matters. This creates a thematic contrast between might makes right mentality and loyalty, as the blue eyes Kaiba stole is not simply a card, but a symbol of Grandpa's friendship to his American friend. When Kaiba attempts to cheat out the Blue Eyes to win the game against Yami, he ultimately ends up losing because he lacks loyalty to anyone except himself, and the Blue Eyes fades away. Quoting Yami directly,
"To my grandpa, that card was more than a collectible. The dragon was torn between its fate to destroy and its loyalty to Grandpa's soul. It chose to destroy itself as the only way to fulfill its duty."
Yami's punishment right after is honestly rather extreme, as he gives Kaiba an illusion of experiencing death in order to attempt to teach him the heart of the cards. Of course, from Kaiba's philosophical perspective, this would be fitting, since only winning and losing is what matters, and losing is tantamount to death. Yami doesn't feel what he did is extreme, which is in character, but this action will have some severe consequences over time. There's some decently complex psychological themes underlying the narrative of Yu-Gi-Oh! If you take the time to dig, and while it's present here, I would also argue it's much more obvious in the following chapters, where Jinochi mysteriously rejoins an old gang of his, and we see a glimpse of his home life with his abusive, drunken father. This starts developing a narrative through line that shows the extent in which generational trauma can affect the children of abusers, and how a family you find instead can help you be happier and make better choices. Part of why Jinochi was such a bully to Yugi was projection. He sees that Yugi isn't being a man by being so emotional and hating to fight, and wants to teach him, not realizing he's doing the same thing his father did to him. It's this thing about him he can't get over, thrown in sharp relief when Yugi is willing to get beat up by Ushio to protect him and Honda. He ultimately chooses to be friends with Yugi rather than let him suffer further. With the Wild Gang, Jinochi joins the gang in an attempt to protect his friends, before quickly realizing that doing so is at best a temporary measure since they start beating up his friends anyway. It critiques the performativity Jinochi is doing in order to emulate his peers, as even with good intentions, he is still enabling the gang in their abuse by not putting a stop to it. Ultimately, Jinochi chooses loyalty towards his true friends over the abuse the gang inflicts on him and others, and is able to overcome them with Yami's help. No toxicity in this homosocial relationship, it's why I like them so much. So that's solid character setup, but how about that plot and lore? Well, from that perspective, the important part of this arc is therefore the 8-part introduction of Shadi, and by extension, the proper introduction to the larger mythology. First, the gang are invited to an exhibit on ancient Egypt, the sponsor of which, Kanekura, is clearly motivated by capitalist ends and intends to sell off Yugi's puzzle by the end of the day after pestering him to put it on display. During the tour, Yugi finds Shadi crying in front of the king. When Yugi asks why he's crying, Shadi explains.
These tears are not mine. This shriveled form, he's become a doll of dust. But still, he is the eternal pharaoh. His spirit lives on with his name. Even the eternal sleep is denied him. The cry of his soul becomes tears and flows down my cheeks.
Shadi immediately pays Kanekura in kind for this and judges his heart, finding his soul to only have room for a monster, personified as Amet. Recovering the puzzle, Shadi is surprised to learn that Yugi is the one who solved it, and finds that his soul contains 2 rooms, representing the 2 Yugis. While Yugi's room is very childlike and innocent, Yami's room is extremely interesting, being labyrinthian and cold, with ancient Egyptian iconography strewn about. When Shadi attempts to find the true room in order to find the secret of the Millennium Puzzle's power, Yami is shown sitting on a throne in an empty room. While he puts on bravado, it's clear that Yami's circumstances scattered and confusing. In some ways, perhaps the way Yami acts, instinctively reacting to defend Yugi and his friends, is to give his life purpose, to help avoid confronting the fear in his heart on who he is and why he's here. Failing his test against Yami, Shadi proceeds to turn Professor Yoshimori, one of the 2 people to uncover the tomb on display, into a puppet for him to control. Shadi doesn't exactly draw a notable distinction between Professor Yoshimori and Kanekura, with him referring to Yoshimori as the other criminal. While Yoshimori doesn't die while possessed, I see some bristling that how Shadi treats him makes him a villain, since Yoshimori is nicer than Kanekura. But it's important to understand that Yoshimori's actions, while less motivated by greed, are still enabling colonialism by excavating that pharaoh and putting him on display against his very clear, obvious wishes of eternal rest. This type of behavior is very true to real life from a cursory glance at how this important history is treated, and not just with artifacts being put on display in museums. The specific brand of archaeology done in Egypt from the 18th century onwards was extremely Eurocentric, with white Western scholars being credited for discoveries over the hundreds of Egyptian workers that did the labor, and the discoveries themselves were handled improperly. Mummified remains unwrapping parties took place in Europe, where bodies would be unwrapped to be gawked at and mocked, and often used to advance racist pseudoscience like the research of Thomas Pettigrew to attempt to prove the bodies were Caucasian and not African. This isn't even getting into all the ways those bodies were consumed and appropriated into various medicines, trinkets, and so on. These bodies were, and in many ways still are, objectified and commodified to extreme degrees, denying the dead the eternal rest they clearly want and instead treating them like exhibits. So anyway, no, I don't think Shadi's treatment of Yoshimori is particularly extreme from his perspective. He's defending a king who can't defend himself, crying the tears the king cannot. Textually, all that happens is Yoshimori becomes a killer puppet and gets a lot of teeth knocked out, which practically happens once a chapter anyway when the heroes do it. And while yes, this is done in order to bring out Yami Yugi and is pretty hostile to Yugi's friends, it's not specifically done with the sole purpose to harm or kill anyone. Realizing that Yoshimori alone isn't enough, Shadi sets the stage for the second game by turning Anzu into a marionette and testing both his and Yami's hearts with Ushabti, which in real life are figurines put in tombs to act as servants in the afterlife. This is flipped on its head to reflect the fear and weakness of both Yugi and Shadi's hearts, where feeling extreme emotion can upset their balance and cause them to break. The first 2 of the 3 trials are mostly simple riddles with an element of fear added to try to break Yami's focus, but the third is worth discussing by having a shadow of Jinochi manifest and act like his old, crueler self. These memories are painful to Yugi, and although Jinochi has now changed, there is still a shred of insecurity that he may try to hurt him in the present. Thus, Yami makes a choice and decides to trust Jinochi at great risk to his own life. Shadi views this as a weakness of the heart, that true strength exists only as an individual. However, he's shocked to find that his illusion is broken from Yami's show of faith. In a way that Shadi never expected, Yami revealed the power of the Millennium Puzzle is unity, the ability to trust others and become stronger for it. While a little cheesy, I think it's a strong moment because it encapsulates so well what resonates with me about this story, this earnestness in trusting others in the face of unknowable forces. Overall, the inclusion of Shadi puts a nice bow on the arc by helping show the direction the series will go in along with building upon the signs of friendship. Shadi is an interesting, morally complex character, and what he says about the purpose of the Millennium items, tools created to protect the tombs of pharaohs, adds a layer of mystery to what exactly Yami's purpose is. Is he simply an extension of the Millennium Puzzle's will, or something more? With all this, you would expect this section of the manga to be the most popular by far, but it ended up being the exact opposite. So, in an effort to save his series from cancellation, Takashi decided to shift focus to Kaiba again and by extension Duel Monsters, leading to a great arc that nevertheless begins signaling the death of the canary. After a few more one-offs, including an honestly pretty cute pastiche of American comics, we get introduced to Seto Kaiba's brother, Mokuba. Mokuba is a toxic little gremlin who likes playing nerd chess and gets tricked, but what's also interesting about Mokuba is how he mimics Seto's antagonism without any of the nuance. He only barely pretends to be friendly before having his cronies hold Yugi with a comedic amount of weapons, and seems to think shows of power are all it takes to be competent at playing a game. This is why Yami immediately tries to teach Mokuba the fundamentals of gaming. He recognizes his immaturity and uses it against him. All this is clearly learned behavior on Mokuba's part. He's mimicking the abusive behaviors he suffers at home under the mistaken notion that this is how you're supposed to behave. This gets untangled and discussed further throughout the arc. Mokuba's loyalty to his brother causes him to get stabbed in the back, with Seto willing to put him through a penalty game for losing to Yami, and Yami has to be the one to pull him out of it. We learn that Seto and Mokuba's adoptive father, Gozaburo, would physically and mentally abuse Seto in order to turn him into the next heir of the corporation, with even his suicide being this extremely toxic lesson on how losers don't even deserve to live. Mokuba is reflecting the behaviors Gozaburo was exhibiting, but he wasn't abused in the same way as Seto. That immaturity Mokuba has is arguably a reflection of how he wasn't broken by abuse the same way that Seto was. He still has the capacity of acting like a child without having to grow up too soon, while slowly learning of how abuse destroyed his family. Now, I mentioned previously that Seto pretends to be friendly, but it's worth pointing out that Kaiba Land was genuinely made so that children can have fun. Even before Kaiba's long road to redemption, there is clear glimpses of a better person in there. Of course, that gets immediately poisoned by Kaiba locking Yugi's grandfather in a duel box and forcing him into an artificial shadow game, with Kaiba noting this form of virtual reality technology was made specifically to replicate the duel with Yugi, a certified Kaiba moment if there ever was one. An extra layer to this is that Kaiba is more than willing to commodify his trauma. It's not just that he needed to win, he needs to win in such a way that totally eclipses his previous loss. It's kind of like Dragon Ball Z power scaling its villains, but it's just always Kaiba playing a card game. So the stage is set, the gang's all here to conquer the Def T tiers, and... oh, right. Joji's also here. Joji is Honda's baby nephew. He exists to hit on Anzu and poop on people. He's the worst, and I hate him. One of the best changes the Toei anime did was completely cut him, and he never shows up again outside of this arc. I really don't know why he was included. This was a terrible decision. As I was saying, a lot of Def T exists to facilitate more elaborate game concepts that the normal format wouldn't allow, such as a laser gun game with actual military personnel trying to kill them, a horror roller coaster ride you can't make noise in or you die, solving a switch puzzle or you lose your hand and die, defeating a serial killer or you die, playing Cubert or you die, just a lot of death threats. It's all pretty compelling stuff, the variety of settings and locations is really nice, and every person in the group gets a moment to shine, sadly including Joji, helping to show the unity concept from earlier. This is further helped along by Yugi having some difficult conversations with his friends that he's been avoiding, like his guilt over putting his friends in danger to begin with. This monologue by Jinochi I found pretty powerful on reread.
Yugi. You remember when I stole part of your puzzle? When I gave that back, you can laugh, but that took more courage than anything. But just then, I started to like myself a little bit for the first time in my life. Listen to me, Yugi. You know what friends are? They're someone you like, and because of them, you learn to like yourself. That's why I hang out with you, Yugi. So if it hurts or whatever, let me share it. That's what friends are for. I'm not giving up yet, so don't you give up either.
Right after, Anzu draws a cute little smiley face on everyone's hands and explains that no matter what the future holds, they'll always be friends and they'll always have their memories of being friends, even after the ink wears off. Compounding this further, shortly after barely managing to get most everyone out of the Cubert room, Honda's jacket gets caught in a cube and it appears he might have died, and Yugi's guilt is so great he finally admits that there's another him inside of him. He expresses fear of how there being another him might cause his friends to stop caring about him. But Jinochi and Anzu insist that regardless of there being another person inside of Yugi, they'll always be friends. This scene is great and can be read a ton of different ways, be it a queer metaphor, a plural metaphor, and so on, and is honestly just a really mature way of dealing with the story's subject matter. Instead of Yugi being vilified for having parts of himself he doesn't understand, he receives support and understanding. It's great, I love it. The Def T arc then winds down with rematches against Mokuba and Seto. The Capsule Monster game isn't much to write home about, although it's cute that Beaton's transformation is a metaphor for Yugi's transformation, while the Duel Monsters game has a lot more complexity than last time thanks to the concept of a hand being introduced. This duel was more or less translated one-to-one in the first episode of the Studio Gallop anime, and I can see why, as it's a good way of introducing Yami and Seto's characters. Seto continually uses strong, expensive cards in order to beat down his opponents, while Yami has to figure out clever strategies to get around that. Sure, this mostly results in a lot of top decking, but to be fair, it's not Yami's deck, and he's putting faith in his grandfather to pull through. The most interesting part of the duel is Yami's genuine fear of losing, preventing him from drawing his last pathetic card, and what pulls him out of it is his genuine connection to his friends. Thus, when he draws the final card, he does so without fear that it may be the wrong one, but hopes it's the right one, which pays off by completing Exodia, who himself is a bit of a metaphor for Yami's character, a fragmented puzzle that needs the help of his friends to be put back together and become strong. Pretty good stuff. To impart this lesson he learned, Yami's choice of punishment is to shatter Seto's evil heart and have him put back the pieces on his own. Considering that the Millennium Puzzle was only solved with Yugi's desire to have true friends, the idea here is that Seto can only put back his heart if he has a reason outside of his hate to. Def T is a solid escalation of what came before and manages to use Duel Monsters as an effective storytelling device before shelving it forever. Yep, we'll never see this game again. The last third of the early manga has a focus on one-off stories again, this time more informed by character development, such as Shinochi going on a game show to help with his dad's gambling debts with his friends supporting him, although the studio ends up going bankrupt before they pay up. One interesting story involves Anzu and Yugi going on a friendly date, with Anzu being frustrated by not seeing the other Yugi. After learning there's a potential bomber in the area, Anzu willingly puts herself in danger in order to see this other Yugi. To her credit, she didn't know the Ferris wheel had a bomb on it, but this is obviously a very foolish thing to do. That said, it's also pretty understandable from her perspective. She wants to see Yami, and Yami only manifests when Yugi is under extreme duress, so she willingly makes herself a damsel Lois Lane style. Throughout the series, there's a pseudo-love triangle between Anzu, Yugi, and Yami, muddled by the fact that Anzu herself often doesn't separate Yugi and Yami in her mind. That said, this begs the question of why she didn't just ask Yugi to talk to Yami for her. Maybe she didn't want to hurt Yugi's feelings, but it'd probably be a lot less hurtful than potentially dying over it. Another interesting story is a two-parter involving Amori, who brings in a cursed game known as Dragon Cards, which has the potential to completely destroy the land of the people playing the game unless the loser's soul is sacrificed. Amori is a dark mirror to Yugi, a version of him that never obtained the Millennium Puzzle and remained without friends and support around him. What's interesting to note is that while Yugi used the Millennium Puzzle to wish for friends, he already did have friends before solving the puzzle in Anzu, and his show of bravery protecting Jinochi and Honda, both things unrelated to solving it. While there's absolutely social factors contributing to Yugi's feelings of insecurity and doubt, he is capable of making friends independently of anyone if he puts himself out there, something that Imori fails to do. Mori instead views the solution to his problems as magical in nature, despite the fact that Yugi would have probably ended up being his friend normally. It's honestly a really tragic story. Due to how he was socialized, Mori seems to think that the secret to being liked and having friends is to become the Guardian of Darkness, not understanding what a heavy responsibility such a title would be, and outright seeks to harm Yugi in order to get what he wants. The game itself is mostly rock, paper, scissors with more steps, and a layer of D&D on top, meaning as is the usual, Yugi gets wrecked and Yami makes a recovery through planning and some luck, and Amori just has his soul taken and effectively dies. Most of the time when someone loses a Shadow game, they experience an illusion but are otherwise fine, but Amori for his hubris is just forever comatose. A manga about playing games. This dark mirror concept clearly intrigued Takahashi, because only a few chapters later he tries the concept again and introduces Bakura. Unlike Amori, who had no powers and was mostly a victim who internalized some really dark things, Bakura is a rather positive and outgoing person, but possesses a lot of power due to his Millennium Ring, with the spirit within it being actively hostile towards his attempts to make friends, and uses them as a tool to get to the other Millennium items, directly stating that there must be a thief to rob a tomb in contrast to the guardian of a tomb. This shows a what-if scenario of Yami being an actively malevolent force in Yugi's life, rather than a morally ambiguous one who softens over time. This dovetails into the Monster World arc, where the gang finally drops all pretense and just directly plays Dungeons & Dragons, with Yami Bakura acting as the Dungeon Master. Me personally, I love D&D stories, and this is probably a formative example as to why. It's fun to see the group express themselves in the game, and the sheer amount of menace Yami Bakura injects into the proceedings helps highlight him as a worthwhile threat. Shortly after starting, the entire group are turned into miniatures due to critical fumbles and supercriticals, and in an interesting parallel to Anzi's choice to leave her fate up to Yami, Yugi chooses to put himself in danger and also put his trust in Yami. Thanks to this, the two Yugis meet each other face to face for the first time in a pretty cool moment, and the rest of the arc becomes devoted to trying to undermine Yami Bakura's rampant cheating, as his ability to seal souls and dice along with acting as game master lets him string the group along. This is an interesting way to go about it, since while Yami Bakura is using underhanded tactics to maintain an advantage, he feels this need still to play fair in many respects, rather than just rocks fall, everyone dies. I think for him, victory needs to be absolute, elsewise he'd probably feel it was unearned, and also he feels compelled to naturally conclude a narrative he constructs. Unfortunately for him, his flair for the dramatic allows the group to get the upper hand. Due to strong visuals and writing, there's some genuine tension with each dice roll, before building to a final showdown where the good Bakura sacrifices his own soul in order to prevent his friends from being killed, although he quickly gets better because of friendship or whatever. This whole mini-arc is a great capstone to the early parts of the story. It gives compelling moments for all the cast and advances their development, and also serves as an effective introduction into stories and characters that would come to characterize the series going forward. It's my second favorite arc of the series for a reason. It's fun and interesting. So what comes next? Oh, cards. So after the success of Def T and Monster World, along with running dry in the one-off well, Takahashi decided to construct a longer story arc fully involving the trading card game. While not necessarily shying away from longer arcs before, Def T was about 15 chapters and Monster World about 10. This was the first arc with the intention of spanning multiple volumes, ultimately clocking in at a fairly sizable 73 chapters. Like every shonen under the sun, the method to introduce a variety of unique and interesting characters and develop deeper storytelling is via a tournament arc, this time initiated by the creator of Duel Monsters, American millionaire Maximilian J. Pegasus. Pegasus is immediately a charismatic and interesting villain. He's a huge troll who is clearly in control of the situation thanks to exploiting the power of the Millennium Eye, and gives Yami his first definitive defeat via a timeout, causing Grandpa's soul to be taken and telling Yugi to meet him at Duelist Kingdom if he wants him back. Some people debate the legitimacy of this win since Yami's final attack didn't land, but Pegasus did place a face down on the field, so I imagine he manipulated the circumstances so he'd win no matter what. Regardless, what a great introduction to a villain. And to get this out of the way since it'll probably come up, I'm fully aware of all the gay jokes surrounding Pegasus. They've existed pretty much since the manga got its first terrible scanlations. While in general, I don't see anything wrong with reading him as queer, myself and various other queer people love him primarily because of his expression and aesthetic, it's important not to conflate that by default with obligatory homosexuality, since that ultimately limits the types of expression that is allowed for certain people. Due to stigma, nebulously acting gay and its various signifiers is something both straight and queer people have to be aware of and avoid with self-policing and code switching. A lot of how Pegasus gets treated by the fandom, although significantly less common nowadays, is rooted in homophobia stemming from the idea that him acting in a way considered stereotypically feminine is something worth mocking, and that's pretty unfair to both the character as written and the real people that find him relatable due to that. In short, straight men can act fruity, don't make a big deal out of it.
You want to duel me with your latest contraption? But I don't even know how the silly device even works. Do I spin it like a top, or roll it like a ball?
Anyway, the character motivation for Yugi is set, but another wrinkle is added by giving Jinochi motivation as well, with us learning more about his fractured home life and how desperately he needs money in order to save his sister Shizuka's eyes. This is the start of Jinochi's arc of self-improvement, where he wants to become stronger as both a person and duelist in order to be the brother his sister needs. So for Duelist Kingdom, the rules of duel monsters get modified a bit, implementing things such as type advantage, field power bonus, and flying, submerged, and so on. This will all seem pretty weird to someone used to the actual trading card game, cue jokes about everyone cheating, but if you critically examine how the rules are explained, the game is being played like a combination of Magic the Gathering meets Dungeons & Dragons. Cards are not bound completely by what is literally written on them, which I'm sure is a ruling nightmare, but this looseness allows for things such as deck building and luck to be important, while also allowing for creativity and quick thinking like prior games in the series. Plus, most of the actual rules are being controlled by the virtual reality system acting as a DM, so if there is any actual cheating, it simply wouldn't allow a move to be played rather than meticulously animating illegal interactions, like destroying a moon or whatever.
The moon! No!
Most of the arc is divided between duels that Yugi and Jinochi are playing, with Yugi playing more experienced and dangerous foes, while Jinochi plays against people he has to get the upper hand with via cards like Time Wizard, or one of his 3 spell cards that he remembered to put in his deck. There's a lot of memorable people here, like Say Goodbye to Exodia Haga, Bandit Keith, and especially My Valentine, who ends up becoming a 6th ranger to the group over time. Honestly, for about the first half of the arc, I found Yugi's side of things to be a bit dull due to the condition imposed midway that he can't lose a duel or else Pegasus will immediately gain control of Kaiba Corp. This is due to a chain of events stemming from Yami sending Seto into a coma, which causes the executives of Kaiba Corp to strike a deal with Pegasus. Since Yami is essentially an expert at duel monsters from the get-go, most of his duels, while still relatively well-written, lack intention since you know he's already solved the puzzle and is just waiting to reveal the steps. This is why I suspect Jinochi's side of things were introduced to begin with. Him being a complete amateur means there can be some actual stakes as he makes beginner's mistakes and has to scrape a recovery. His over-reliance on Time Wizard ends up punishing him in his duel with Ghost Kozuka, and he instead has to rely on his own cards to succeed. Jinochi consistently feels like an underdog from smart writing choices, and it's really interesting. Perhaps unsurprising, one of my favorite duels from the arc is against the Meikyu brothers, since Takahashi just directly turns the game into D&D with space and movement as an important consideration, and Jinochi has to learn to work together with Yugi effectively so as to not be the weakest link. It's great stuff, they both save each other's hides multiple times, and it feels like they genuinely grow closer as a result. All that said, there's one duel of Yugi's worth analyzing, his duel against the Ventriloquist of the Dead, who has Seto's stolen deck and is using this creepy puppet to taunt Yugi. In terms of metaphor, this duel represents the conflict Seto is experiencing as a character, whether or not to hold on to hate or let it go to fix his broken heart. Yami is genuinely pissed that Seto's skills as a duelist are mocked by the Ventriloquist, so much so that it causes Seto to wake up from his coma, which causes once again an attacking Blue Eyes to fade away. This is extremely interesting to me knowing Kaiba's character. He uses strong, expensive, powerful monsters in order to beat down his opponent, but the action that metaphorically symbolizes his mind and heart coming back together is his spirit abstaining from attacking, choosing to fade away to spare somebody else. Another interesting bit of nuance is that while Seto quickly expresses worry for Mokuba since Pegasus kidnapped him and heads to Duelist Kingdom due to that, the actual reason for why he recovered is because of Yami's determination. He wants to face him again as a rival and as an equal, and to do that, Seto has to discard a part of himself that is cruel and unyielding. Yami's influence has caused a major shift in him and made him a better person. But we'll have to put a pin in that for a while until we discuss Dark-Sided Dimensions. Oh right, and lest I forget, let's discuss that one scene in the second anime cut, where Yugi and Anzu sit under the stars and have a quiet, intimate moment. Yugi, a bit sadly, says that the person Anzu wants is not him and tries to call Yami, but Anzu stops him and gives a rather revealing monologue. This aspect of Yugi's character was almost entirely scrubbed away in adaptation, but in the manga he's such a shy little kid, and moments like these help to illustrate his growing maturity through the connections with his friends, how they help him see the best of himself, how he doesn't have to hide away for what other people want. It also shows a growth moment for Anzu, who previously would have tried to deliberately have Yami show up by putting herself in danger. While she's always been compassionate, this is one of the first times where she puts what she wants aside for the sake of her friend, and it's really sweet. While I find the subsequent panic duel pretty boring and edgy, the fact Yami does it in order to help Mai shows an expanding empathy, since Mai genuinely tries to be a better person before this and gets cruelly maligned by Panic as a result. To the Shadow Realm of the Putting all these bits together, after Jinochi and Yugi both obtain 10 stars and reach Pegasus's castle, they're greeted by a determined Kaiba who's been manipulated by Pegasus to duel Yugi to save Mokuba. The narrative already answers the question of why not Jinochi, since he gets trounced by Seto as soon as he landed, and also gives the encounter intricate layers by having this event be artificial rather than natural. I genuinely don't think at this point in time Seto is ready to be Yugi's rival, but he has to be outside of his control, and that's quite interesting to me. Despite Seto pulling out a new way of dueling and many trump cards, Yami's clever thinking ends up giving him the upper hand and thoroughly incapacitates his strategy. Realizing he's on the verge of losing a third time, he has this frankly horrifying vision of him failing to save Mokuba while a younger version of himself glares. Seto rebuilt his heart and is more compassionate, but what use was that reconstruction if he fails to save one of the most important people in his life? He had already failed Mokuba by betraying him, and to let that happen again means all that growth was for nothing. If he can't win here, he feels he can't make amends. So, making a choice, he decides to do a final gambit and threatens his own life if Yami continues his attack, heavily implying he's willing to jump from a ledge if he loses. This is a pretty extreme thing for Seto to do, but from his perspective, it makes complete sense. While he is improving as a person, he still internalized a lot of Gozaburo's abuse and manipulation, and probably still genuinely believes that being a loser means death. Yami's perspective, meanwhile, is extremely complex due to him not wanting to confront issues with his identity, because who is Yami if he doesn't win for Yugi? He has no memories, no being other than persona. He is solely defined by how he reflects Yugi. So when he thinks, I can't afford to lose, I read it as he's scared to face his own identity, scared of losing and not being himself. If games are like opposing mirrors, then when the moment comes for Yami to choose to attack, that reflects him more than he probably wants it to. Yami sees the strength of Kaiba's conviction and thinks the solution is to match sword with sword, but that's wrong. Yugi seizes back control from Yami for the first time ever and chooses to lose instead. This both shows how afraid of his other self he is, and also his bravery and his willingness to lose to spare Kaiba. He did something that Yami was incapable of doing. Of course, after winning, Kaiba sneaks up to rub salt in the wound, another certified Kaiba moment, but Anzu isn't having it and rips his darn head off.
Yugi may have lost one lousy Duel Monsters game, but at least he hasn't lost his heart. Not like you, Seto Kaiba!
This whole final part of the duel is a complex, interesting scene that affects both Yugi and Yami's character arcs going forward. It kinda speaks to me on another level similar to Yugi's confession in Def Tea. This is the kind of stuff I'm referring to when I say Yu-Gi-Oh's story is meaningful and influential to me, and it's why I still hold it in high regard despite its many flaws. Proceeding on, Mai comes along and gives Yugi a chance to get his star chips back. Initially, he refuses out of a misguided method of placating Yami after going against his wishes, but Jinochi talks some sense into him and tells him to think about his own feelings instead. Yami is extremely prideful due to his skills, and while there is something admirable about that, it becomes toxic when pride is used to push away connections with other people. It holds you back. Yugi is not here out of a sense of duelist pride. He's here to save his grandpa, so of course he takes him. After watching Seto get wharfed like a fool because he decided to keep using blue eyes despite Pegasus having the perfect counter to them, along with some misadventures at night that show how cool a character Jinochi is and how lame a character Honda is, the finals to Duelist Kingdom begins proper with the duel between Mai and Yami. This duel, in my opinion, is the highlight of the arc. Yami is distracted by being on the precipice of dueling Pegasus, to the point of feeling extremely intimidated under the pressure. Mai is dead set on dueling Yami honorably, displaying a great deal of growth from the kindness he showed to her. Yami doesn't see her, however, she is just a reflection in his eye. During the duel, Yami makes numerous tactical errors, such as running into Mirror Wall multiple times, which frustrates Mai because she is honestly playing at the top of her game and knows that she isn't being taken seriously by him despite everything she's putting in. Recognizing the conflict in him, Mai reiterates something you can show but you can't see, throwing back the riddle Jinochi gave her before. Explaining her thought process after losing to Jinochi, Mai helps Yami to realize that Yugi's forfeit to Kaiba was brave, and that it was Yami's fear of losing that was holding them back from making the correct choice. In Yami's words,
"The strength of the other me made up for my weakness."
It's easily one of my favorite moments of the manga. Typically, bravery in a shonen series is always conceptualized as being aggressive, willing to take action, getting things done, etc., which Yami often embodies in his contrast to Yugi. But here it's inverted and shows how not taking action can be just as brave, how caring for other people and their well-being can be the courageous thing to do. Internalizing this lesson, Yami immediately recognizes Mai as a worthy opponent, and manages to win through a combination of smart plays, bluffs, and lucky draws. It's genuinely great writing and an effective capstone on Mai's role in Duelist Kingdom, going from a selfish, vain person into a genuine friend and ally. The duel with Bandit Keith is also decent. Keith is a real jerk and we all love him for it. Jinochi needing to out-gamble Keith is fun. It's a good time. What I want to focus on, though, is the end of the duel, where right after winning, Jinochi turns down dueling against Yugi for tactical reasons. This is perhaps surprising to anime fans who saw the filler duel placed here and assumed it was from the original source material, but I think the manga's justifications for not including this are very solid, since not only does it prevent revealing tactics to Pegasus unnecessarily, but it also shows the amount of trust that Jinochi's built up of Yugi that he's willing to let him win for the sake of his sister. This is again showing different forms of bravery than is traditional. It's great stuff. Oh, also, Bandit Keith gets killed after threatening Pegasus with a knife in a honestly pretty horrifying scene. This shows a pretty dark side to Pegasus that thematically does make sense. Bandit Keith is a fallen duelist who's regressed into being a bitter alcoholic, and his constant cheating is a reflection of this. While Pegasus certainly doesn't play fair, even he has his limits to what he views as acceptable. That said, the anime choosing to spare Keith, I feel, is a better decision, even if that doesn't really amount to anything for his character overall. Anyway, now for the duel with Pegasus. This one's pretty decent, as Pegasus gradually reveals the amount that he's able to see of his Millennium Eye, and acts like a massive troll with his tune cards. Consistently, Yami is put on the back foot and is completely unable to counteract his mind scan. With no other options and an attack away from losing completely, Yami finally hears the voice of Yugi. This isn't the first conversation Yami and Yugi have had directly, if you recall Monster World, and there was one point Yami spoke to Yugi directly when giving advice for Jinochi, but this is the first time where Yugi has agency in this interaction. They've both grown a bit since the duel of Kaiba, and so they resolve to trust each other here as equal partners, which ends up being the exact thing needed to counteract the mind scan. This shakes Pegasus' confidence. Without being able to rely on his eye, he makes a lot of mistakes from not being able to properly predict unknown variables. So, after getting his tunes murked, Pegasus gives some important information, notably that duel monsters originated in ancient Egypt, and begins a real shadow game. Like Monster World, this shadow game is a battle between the holders of the Millennium items, which becomes immediately taxing to Yugi to the point he collapses from the mental strain. More than anything, Yugi is just a kid thrust into extraordinary circumstances, and him being out of commission puts Yami at great risk. So what pulls Yami through this? Well, the power of friendship. Alright, I see a lot of people complain about this moment where Yugi's friends block Pegasus' mind scan, seeing it as a strange plot contrivance, but I actually disagree. Pegasus is trying to pierce the deepest recesses of Yami's heart, which we've previously seen during Shadi's chapters was an endless maze of Egyptian iconography with nothing else in it, in contrast to Yugi's being childlike with no dark thoughts. We even see these rooms referenced in this arc, indicating it's a deliberate and unforgotten element to the story. Therefore, what does it mean in terms of character and theme that when Pegasus searches Yami's heart, he sees Yugi's friends? My read is that Yami didn't feel like he was a person outside of Yugi. He exists often as a reaction to external circumstances, forcing Yugi into situations he isn't equipped to handle. However, this assertion is ultimately wrong. Yami has grown from interacting with other people. His heart doesn't just hold sadness and mystery anymore. This bit shows that Yami is valued as his own person rather than just as an extension of Yugi. In the deepest recesses of his heart, he knows that his connections to others will see him through the dark, and it ultimately ends up being true of him winning due to that. High five. Now for the wrap-up of the arc. The souls of everyone are freed, and Pegasus details his backstory proper, including how he's 24? Wild. The broad strokes of the story was he went on an existential journey to find meaning in his life, encountered Shadi and Kolana, and was then tested and found worthy of possessing the Millennium Eye, which led to the creation of duel monsters. So that's all well and good in theory, but let's discuss a complication that arises from this. There is surprising racism in the writing towards the other members of Shadi's group. Like, they're literally dressed all in black and have racially stereotyped designs in contrast to Shadi. And when Pegasus's eye needs to be removed, they're shown taking a perverse form of glee in the thought of hurting him. They are framed as a racial other, a threat, and given nothing more than that. For what purpose? This doesn't get talked about very often when critiquing Yu-Gi-Oh!, primarily because the second anime removes most instances of this element, but as much as the story incorporates genuine elements of ancient Egyptian and Kemetic tradition, and does argue for respect towards that culture, along with having Egyptian characters who are well written in their own right, it can just as often fall into unresearched stereotypes and some genuine racism like a lot of Orientalist media can often do, and this is sadly not the worst example in the manga. As much as I love Yu-Gi-Oh!, it does have genuine flaws that are worth criticizing, and this is one of those instances. Putting that aside for now, Pegasus also mentions an evil intelligence that exists within the Millennium items, which is very heavy foreshadowing for the final arc. This ends up beginning Yami's search for his memories, which will encompass the remaining parts of the narrative. Notably, he chooses to spare Pegasus from a penalty game after hearing his story, something he is usually never inclined to do. The idea of being this great evil and not even being sure if that's true or not clearly shocked him, and he didn't want that notion to be proven correct. Oh, right, Pegasus is also murdered by Yami Bakura here. This is one of the largest differences between the manga and second anime, and has rather interesting implications. So on one hand, yes, I'm very biased here, but I think the second anime sparing Pegasus was the better choice. Pegasus is iconic and ultimately not really that bad of a person aside from being rich. Like, if this was a different shonen series, I could see him getting a redemption arc over time, or at least more to do since he is the creator of duel monsters in the modern day. Which does get taken advantage of for filler in the second anime, finally getting rid of Hayato and GX.
But your card, it was a gift from the angels themselves. An angel named Chumley.
A whole television special about him potentially dying, which is kind of ironic. Point is, he becomes an important part of the overarching canon of Yu-Gi-Oh! If you care about that like me. On the other hand, killing him here is appropriately tragic, thematically appropriate, and fits within the story of the manga within its own context far better. First, this builds up Yami Bakura as an encroaching threat, with this being his proper reintroduction after multiple teases within the arc, and along with reincorporating Shadi, it helps to tie in the early parts of the manga more. Plus, it makes sense for Yami Bakura to do this. He's a thief. He's here to get all the items. Here's his chance. This being the end to Pegasus' character also makes sense. He was forever caught in the cycle of trying to capture his lost love and life through illusions, and it's only in death where they are truly reunited. All this pain he put other people through was ultimately pointless, and all it leaves is his echoes. Honestly, it's pretty depressing, but it was the trajectory he was going in, and I think it's important to show that. This is more complicated than the manga being more dark or edgy. The manga is also dealing with something much more psychologically complicated, and is doing so in a way that is respectful to that complexity. But even with this, the arc still ends happily. The Kaibas are reunited. Shizuka is going to get the money for her operation. High fives all around. The manga still retains optimism even after its darkest moments, which will become especially relevant when contending with the next arc.